In photography, one of the hotly debated issues for many years now is should you use a crop sensor camera or a full-frame camera. I've used both for many years and have experienced using them in a lot of different situations, and I thought I'd share my thoughts today. There are definitely pluses and minuses or benefits to each one, and I think what you really need to think about is which one suits you best. I don't think that better is a term that really can be used to describe them. There are certainly areas where one outshines the other and one makes more sense to use than the other. But to make a blanket statement like one is just better than the other, I don't really think makes much sense because everybody has different needs. If you're shooting wildlife, if you're shooting sports, if you're shooting things that are very far away, a crop sensor camera might make more sense for you. If you're shooting in low light, if you're shooting, portraiture, weddings, perhaps a full frame camera might make more sense. A lot of it also depends on where you've come from, whether this is your first camera or whether you're building on a system that you've been putting together for quite a while as well. In my case, I started with an APS-C or a crop sensor camera. I think it was a Nikon D40 was my first camera that I ever owned that was digital. I did not know anything else and thought it was the greatest thing ever. The fact that I had a digital camera that could take pictures and edit them on my computer and get going was really something. Specifically when it comes to APS-C or crop sensor cameras, what that means is the sensor's smaller than the full frame or 35 millimeter camera. And originally that was designed as a cost savings. It was, very expensive to make chips back in the day. And camera companies, first to launch the smaller size. The thing that a lot of people that came from the film world complained about was it changed the focal length of the lens and how the lenses, worked when you put them on, because you have to multiply that out. So if you put, for example, a 50 millimeter lens, which is a standard lens, on a crop sensor body, you have to multiply it by, either 1.5 or 1.6, depending on whether you're using a Nikon or a Canon or a similar system. So if your 50 millimeter lens, as you've probably heard, becomes a 75 or an 85 millimeter lens, something like that. And that put a lot of people off. People wanted to use their lenses natively so that they were used to seeing the same image, the same field of view through the camera. So the crop factor can be looked at as either a positive or a negative. The downside, as I just mentioned, is that the lenses don't work the same way as they do on a standard 35 millimeter film or full frame camera. The advantage to that is that it makes the lenses longer. It gives you longer reach. Hence, if you're shooting things like sports where the action is far away from you, or wildlife, for example, where it's very difficult to get close to birds and things like that, the lenses have longer reach and get you closer to your subject. This is something that can be a huge benefit for you, of course, because you can fill the frame with your subject, you can get closer, you can have more detail. So definitely a plus. The other advantage to that, of course, is the cost of lenses. It's definitely a lot more money to buy, say, a 600 millimeter lens than it is to buy a 400 millimeter. They're both expensive lenses, of course, but you certainly can save money. And putting that 400 millimeter lens on your crop sensor body gives you 600 or 650 millimeters of reach, which is really nice, gets you closer to the subject. One of the other big advantages with crop sensor cameras is you actually get more depth of field than you do with a full frame camera. And a lot of people will talk about the advantage of using a full-frame camera to get a shallower depth of field, and that certainly is a real thing. But there are definitely situations where you want more depth of field. If you're shooting, say, a group, or you're shooting something that is a very large subject and you need to have a lot of it in focus, the crop sensor camera actually makes it easier to do that at similar apertures and shutter speeds. So, for example, if, I do a lot of event work where I have to take group pictures and you have 2, 3, 4 rows of people in a very dark situation, for example, that you want to make sure everybody's in focus. On a full frame camera, I might have to put it at f8 or f11 to get everybody in focus. And that requires a lot more power out of the strobes or out of the flash in order to light everybody because of the greater depth of field. On a crop sensor camera, I can actually shoot at a lower aperture. I could shoot at, say, f4 or f5.6 and get a similar depth of field that I would get on the full frame camera. And that requires a lot less light, lower ISO, less power from the strobes in order to light everybody up properly. So it's not always about getting a shallower depth of field. I think there are many times where I require a greater depth of field than a shallower depth of field, and definitely a crop sensor camera can help with that big time. So another one of the big advantages is the autofocus point coverage on the sensor. On a crop sensor camera, generally speaking, from what I've seen, the coverage is much greater because the sensor is smaller. So the AF module in the camera can cover larger areas of the sensor. You've got points to the extremes, the left and right or the top and bottom, which is an advantage. So if you're shooting sports and you need to track a subject that's moving quickly, not only do you get the benefit of the reach to get closer to the subject, but your AF points are going to cover more of the area, and you might be able to track the subject easier. So definitely an advantage of a crop sensor camera. I've covered a lot of sporting events where people are using APS-C cameras because of those two reasons. So it's definitely a big plus. One of the advantages that people like to talk about when it comes to crop sensor cameras is how they can be much smaller and lighter. And that can be definitely true. I think it depends on the system that you're using. The Fuji X system that I shot for a while, for example, has really nice small and compact bodies, and some of the lenses, particularly the primes, can be really nice and small and compact, very discreet for street photography or just really nice for travel. In the Nikon system that I shoot, the D7200, which is the crop sensor camera, is almost the same size as my D750 full frame. And to me, that's actually an advantage. I like that. When I'm using both cameras at the same time, it's much more comfortable. The buttons are in the same place, and the feel is very similar. So it just, for muscle memory and when you're using them, it just makes it a more seamless kind of system where I don't feel like I'm using a totally different camera when I switch between one or the other. And I think the last point that people talk about when it comes to crop sensor cameras is that they tend to be less money than full frame systems. And that certainly used to be the case. Although over the last number of years, it seems to me that things have changed quite a bit, particularly when it comes to the Canon system. They have a lot of full-frame bodies that are actually less expensive than some competitors' crop sensor cameras. If you look at Fuji's, XT system, for example, you can spend more on one of those bodies. I've seen them here in Canada for about $2,300, $2,400 for a new crop sensor camera, where you can get into the Canon full frame system for $1,500. So, $800, $900 less to get into a full frame body. And that's just the body, of course. You have to look at the lenses after that and see what you need. So the cost savings issue might be true, but I don't think in all cases. So if you are still shopping, you need to kind of pay attention to what's going on and see what makes the most sense for you. So let's talk about some of the downsides of the APS-C system versus full frame. And I think the biggest one is, from my experience, image quality. There's definitely excellent APS-C cameras. The D7200 that I use, I've shot Fuji's, X system. They are excellent image quality for sure. Specifically in better light, or if you're using them in daylight, I find that the image quality is very difficult to tell the difference between that and a modern full frame camera. But there are definitely differences, and using both side by side, I can always see the difference. And especially as the light starts to drop, or it becomes a more challenging situation to shoot in, all things being equal, and that's important. You kind of have to look at sensors generationally. There needs to be if you can't compare a modern APS-C system to a 10-year-old full-frame camera, or a 10-year-old APS-C system to a modern full-frame camera. You need to kind of look at roughly the same age of sensor and the same technology, to kind of keep things fair. The full-frame camera is definitely better in low light, definitely has a little bit nicer color, and definitely has a little bit better fall-off when it comes to the subject as well. And I've just found that there's about a half a stop to a stop advantage, with a full frame camera over the crop sensor. So image quality is definitely a plus. That's not to say that crop sensors are bad. I could certainly do all of my commercial work and all of my professional work with the crop sensor camera. you have to know how to use the system, how to light properly, and how to take advantages of what the camera can do and how to cover for any weaknesses it might have. That's part of doing the job. One of the other advantages of the full frame system is the ability to use lenses at their native focal lengths. I shoot manual focus or older film camera lenses, and being able to use them the way they were designed is an advantage in my view. This, for example, is a lens that I really, really like. It's a 28 millimeter AIS lens from Nikon, designed for film cameras back in the day, manual autofocus, manual aperture. So when I put it on the full frame camera, it works as a true 28 millimeter. I'm seeing the way it was designed to be used. When I put it on the APS-C system, it becomes roughly a 40 millimeter or 42 millimeter equivalent, which is a great focal length, certainly handy, very nice to use, but it just doesn't look the same way that it does on the full frame camera. And, there's nothing wrong with using lenses that way. I just think that, when I'm putting together a system, I like to have certain focal lengths. I like to think of a certain way of shooting, and having lenses at their native focal length, the way they were designed, is a plus for me. So the combination of the image quality and being able to use lenses at their standard format is probably the main two reasons why I stick to a full frame camera for my main system. So I think if you're looking for your first camera, definitely consider both APS-C and full frame. They certainly have their strengths and weaknesses, and the cost factor and the size and weight factor are things that you'll have to figure out for which one makes the most sense for you. For me personally, I like having one of each. I like having a full frame and a crop sensor camera for the reasons that I outlined. The strengths and weaknesses of each one make a lot of sense in certain situations, and particularly with the Nikon system. The fact that the bodies are the same size practically, the buttons are in the same places, they share the same battery, the same memory cards, the same accessories, the lenses work equally well on both systems. It makes sense for me to have both. And so I'm not one of those people that says you must shoot a full frame or you must shoot an APS-C. I think they're both great systems. I hope this gave you some insights into the differences between full frame and crop sensor cameras and helps you to decide which one is right for you. Or perhaps like me, you'll end up using both. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you in the next one.